She showed up at my door at 11:47 on a Friday night, barefoot on my porch steps with her hazard lights still blinking out by the curb. And I want to tell you that I handled it gracefully, that I said something calm and grounded and appropriate. But what actually happened is that I just stood there in a worn-out Henley I'd owned since before we were married, holding a half-empty glass of water I'd been carrying from the kitchen for no particular reason. And when she looked at me and said, I didn't know where else to go, the only thing I could find to say back was, okay. Not come in. Not are you all right. Not what happened or how long have you been out there or do you need anything at all. Just okay. Delivered in the flat, unornamented voice of someone who hasn't fully processed what he's looking at yet. And somehow, that was exactly the right thing. Because her shoulders dropped about 2 inches, and the rigid way she'd been holding herself since I opened the door released all at once, and she exhaled slowly and completely, and she just stood there for a moment in the yellow porch light with her eyes slightly closed, the way a person looks when they have finally, after a very long time driving, actually stopped. My name is Daniel. Dan, mostly. I'm 41 years old. I run a small HVAC company out of a strip mall office on Route 9 between a nail salon and a tax preparation place that's only open 4 months a year. And I live alone in a 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood that was supposed to feel too big for one person and mostly just feels like mine now in the specific, settled way that a space does when you've been the only person in it long enough that you stop noticing the extra rooms. I know which floorboards creak and in what order. I know exactly how long it takes the hot water to reach the bathroom sink on a cold morning. I know that the cardinal comes to the backyard bird feeder every morning around 7, reliable as a clock, because I put that feeder up last spring on a Saturday when I had nothing pressing and found myself at the garden center without fully understanding how I'd gotten there, which is the kind of thing that happens to you when you've been alone long enough that you start filling the open hours with small, purposeful tasks just to give the weekend some shape. The kitchen has 1 too many bar stools because I bought 4 when I moved in and never returned the extra, which tells you something about how I relate to problems that don't urgently demand resolution. The guest room has fresh sheets on the bed year-round because my mother installed this as a non-negotiable principle of keeping a house, and I have never once questioned it, even during the long stretches when nobody was coming and nobody had been coming for months and the sheets were just sitting there being laundered on a rotation for no one in particular. That turned out to matter more than I ever would have anticipated. My ex-wife, Kara, and I were married for 6 years, together for 8. We separated when I was 35 and she was 33, and the divorce was finalized 14 months after that, on a Tuesday afternoon in October that I remember mostly because the parking lot outside the mediator's office had leaves on it that nobody had gotten around to raking yet, and I spent a few seconds looking at them while I waited for Kara to button her coat, and I thought, someone should get to those before it rains. That is the kind of thought you have when the bigger thing happening is too large to look at directly. It was not a dramatic divorce. There was no screaming, no nuclear moment, no single catastrophic revelation that blew everything apart at once in a way you could point to afterward and say that was the end. It was a slow structural failure, a settling, a gradual drift away from something true that neither of us was able to see clearly while we were inside it. We had been functioning as considerate, well-mannered roommates for somewhere between 1 and 2 years before we admitted it out loud. We liked each other. We were kind in the ordinary daily ways. We just weren't in love in the specific way that makes 2 people keep choosing each other when the choosing gets hard. And by the time we were both willing to say that, the distance between where we were and where we'd have needed to be felt too wide to cover with whatever we had left. She got the condo. I kept the house. We divided the savings without fighting about it, shook hands in that parking lot like we'd concluded a reasonable business transaction, and if that sounds a little sad, it's because it was not painful in any sharp way, just quieter than something that had mattered that much probably should have been allowed to end. She started seeing Marcus about 8 months after the divorce was finalized. I heard about it first from her sister Becca, who has known me for 15 years and who delivered this information with the very specific, careful neutrality of someone who is absolutely monitoring for a reaction and would deny that if you pointed it out. I gave her as little as I could manage. Kara mentioned him herself a few weeks later during one of the twice-a-year phone calls we'd settled into. The kind of call that exists to confirm that the other person is still out there and more or less okay. Not the kind where you tell each other anything that actually has weight to it. He was in commercial real estate. He was charming in the specific practiced way of someone who has learned that sustained attention is its own form of currency and has made deliberate use of that knowledge. By all accounts available to me, Becca's mainly delivered with her characteristic mix of detail and editorial, Kara seemed genuinely happy with him in the early stretch, lighter than I'd seen her in the last couple of years of our marriage, more recognizably herself. They got married 2 winters ago in a small ceremony in Sedona. I sent a card. I went to a physical store and stood in the aisle for longer than was strictly necessary and selected one that felt like it meant what I wanted it to mean, which was, I'm glad you found something good. And I mean that without any hidden clauses. I sent it because I meant it. I want to be clear about that even now. I hadn't spoken to her in 5 months when my phone lit up with her name on that Friday night. 5 months isn't estrangement. It's just the natural distance that forms between two people whose lives have fully separated, when the reasons to be in regular contact have gradually thinned to the point where you're no longer in the habit of reaching for each other. We'd had a brief call around the holidays, the kind where both people say everything is good, and neither one particularly means it in any deep way. It's just what that call is for, a way of maintaining the thread without pulling on it. I had no particular reason after hanging up that December evening to think the thread would need pulling on before spring. So when my phone lit up and I saw her name, my first thought was something had happened to someone in her family, a parent, an emergency that had made her skip past the people she normally would have called first. I answered on the second ring, already bracing, and then she told me she was in my driveway. I walked to the front window and confirmed it. Her car, hazard lights going, parked at the off angle of someone who arrived somewhere, and the parking was not really the point. I put my phone down without properly ending the call and went to the door. She was dressed for somewhere nicer than my porch. Dark silk blouse, tailored slacks, small gold earrings that caught the porch light when she moved her head. From across the yard, she could have been returning from dinner somewhere good. A reservation, an event, an evening that ended on pleasant, ordinary terms. It was only up close, in the porch light, that I could see the mascara had traveled in that specific way it travels when you've been crying seriously for a sustained period of time. Stopped, waited, and then tried to look like you hadn't. She was holding her heels in one hand by the straps, dangling at her side like she'd removed them at some point during the drive, and it had simply never occurred to her to put them back on. Her feet were bare on my porch steps. It was 52 degrees out. I want to tell you I noticed all of these things in some kind of orderly, observant way, but it was more like they landed on me all at once. The earrings and the heels and the mascara and the bare feet on the cold wood as a single composite image of someone who had been through something and had come through it to here, to my porch, specifically. I didn't say a word about any of it because none of it needed commentary. We looked at each other. I said, "Okay." She said, "Thank you." We stood there in the porch light for a full minute without anyone saying anything else. And that silence was, I think, the most useful thing either of us offered that night. I made her tea. Tea is what you make when someone shows up at your house in pain and your hands need something to do and you want to signal, without requiring language, that you're not going to make any of this harder than it already is. I turned off the overhead kitchen light. Too bright, too clinical, too much like being seen under examination, and used the smaller one above the stove, which throws a warm amber that is easier to be sat in. She sat at the counter on the bar stool she'd once helped me select at a furniture store that doesn't exist anymore. We'd spent a notable amount of time debating the practical merits of different seat heights, and she'd been right, and I'd never actually told her so. She wrapped both hands around the mug like she needed the warmth from the outside in. I stood against the opposite counter and waited. I am genuinely better at waiting than people tend to assume. When your work is diagnosing systems that aren't functioning correctly, you learn pretty quickly that the first explanation is almost never the real one. and that the most useful thing you can do is let the problem show you what it actually is before you start trying to fix anything. She looked at the mug, then, "He's been seeing someone." She said it in the tone you use when you've deliberately stripped the emotion from the sentence because it's the only way the sentence is going to get out of you intact. "For 7 months. Her name is Kelsey. She's 29. A pause. "He told me her name. I didn't ask for it. He just offered it up. Like specificity might somehow make it more manageable." A longer pause. "It didn't." I waited. "I drove around for a while and then I sat in the parking lot of a grocery store for almost 2 hours, Marissa," she said. "It was closed. I just sat there because everywhere I thought of going had someone in it who would need me to be further along than I actually was. And then I kept thinking about—" She stopped, started again. "I kept thinking about you." I let that sit. "Okay," I said, because it was the only word available to me that night, and she looked up and gave me a smile that was small and exhausted and completely, unmistakably real. More real than anything I'd seen from her in years. "You always do that," she said quietly. "You just receive the thing. You don't add anything on top of it. You just, okay." I said I hadn't realized I did that. "Is it annoying?" She shook her head. And when she said no, she meant it in the way that means she's actually thought about it. I want to be honest about what was happening inside me during all of that. As honest as I know how to be about something I spent the next 4 months actively choosing not to look at too directly. There was compassion. Plain, uncomplicated compassion, the kind that doesn't need examining because it's just the basic human response to someone you care about sitting in your kitchen in pain at midnight. That part was easy. The part that wasn't easy was the thing underneath it, the thing I noticed and deliberately did not examine, that felt like what happens to a room when you open a window you'd stopped thinking of as something that could open. Something changed. Something came in. I didn't name it. I showed her to the guest room because she was in no condition to drive and she knew it. And I found the spare toothbrush under the bathroom sink and a clean t-shirt from the drawer that turned out, when I unfolded it, to technically be hers, left from some wash cycle years back when our laundry was the same laundry, kept in the drawer all this time without me ever registering it as something to deal with. She thanked me again. I told her she didn't have to keep doing that. She said she was working on it. I went to my room and lay on top of the covers in the dark and spent a long and careful time telling myself that what I was feeling was compassion. That compassion is a substantial and legitimate emotion, and it made complete sense for it to fill a lot of space, and I almost made it all the way through believing that before I finally fell asleep. In the morning, she was still there. I had half expected her to be gone before I woke up. She was always the earlier riser, the one who had been productive for 2 hours by the time I was still learning to be conscious, but didn't. But when I came downstairs, she was on the back porch with another mug of tea, the blanket from the linen closet around her shoulders, watching the yard with the still, settled quality of someone who has come through the acute part of something difficult and has arrived in the quieter place that comes after. She'd washed her face, found a hair tie somewhere, probably the bathroom drawer where I keep miscellaneous things I've never bothered to sort properly. She looked like herself in a way she hadn't looked last night, more solid inside her own skin, more present, less like she was holding herself together, and more like she simply was together, which is a distinction you can see if you know what to look for. "I didn't know you had a bird feeder," she said, when she heard me step outside. I told her I'd put it up last spring, that there was a cardinal who came most mornings around 7 and had strong and consistent feelings about sunflower seeds relative to other offerings. We both looked at the feeder. No cardinal yet. "He'll come," I said. She said she believed me. There was something about the way she said that, simple, without any of the careful navigation that had characterized most of our communication in recent years, that landed differently than it should have for such a small sentence. We stood there in the cool morning air for a minute or two looking at the empty feeder together, and it was the most effortless silence I'd been inside with another person in a longer time than I wanted to admit to myself. She stayed for breakfast. Eggs, scrambled, with sharp cheddar and cracked black pepper, because that's what Saturday mornings look like in my kitchen, and I wasn't going to let a complicated history be the reason to change my own routine in my own house. She sat at the table, the actual table, not the counter stool, and we talked the way we almost never had when we were actually married, with real weight to it, without either of us performing a version of ourselves that was easier to be in the presence of. She told me about the last few months in specific terms, the small things she'd explained away, the particular exhausting quality of feeling peripheral to your own life. I listened. Refilled her mug twice without asking. She asked about the business, my parents, the back hallway leak I'd mentioned months ago on our last call, and her questions had the quality I'd almost forgotten she had. Specific, genuinely interested, wanting the real answer rather than its approximate shape. After she left that afternoon, shoes back on, sunglasses, composure recovered and visible, I stood at my kitchen counter for a long time looking at nothing in particular, which is not a thing I do. I do things. I fix things. Standing in your own kitchen, staring at the counter where someone's mug was a few hours ago is a new behavior, and new behaviors in yourself are always worth paying attention to, even when you're not ready to understand them yet. My best friend Kevin has known me for 26 years and has never in that entire span successfully kept a thought to himself when he believed it was relevant. He's a contractor. We trade labor when the situation calls for it, and on Sunday evenings we keep a standing arrangement that involves my porch and cold drinks and the mutual understanding that we are not going to discuss our feelings for several hours, which has historically worked well for both of us. 3 Sundays after Kara's first visit, Kevin looked at me with the expression he has when he's been sitting on something for a while, and has finally decided it's time and said, "You're still in love with your ex-wife." Not again. Still. I caught the word. I didn't say what, or that's not what's going on here, or any of the deflections you reach for when you intend to spend a few minutes arguing with something that actually hit. I just turned and looked at the yard. Kevin nodded like I'd confirmed it verbally. "Yeah," he said, "I figured." I said it was complicated. He said from his vantage point, which was, he acknowledged, slightly less internal than mine, but arguably more objective. It really wasn't. I said she was technically still married at that time. He said the word technically was carrying more freight than 4 syllables ought to be asked to bear. I said I had no way of knowing what she felt, that she'd come to me because I was familiar and low pressure, and the option that required the least explanation, and reading more into it than that was projection. Kevin was quiet for a moment, which for Kevin is so unusual it registers as a kind of statement in itself. Then he said, "Dan, do you actually think she drove to your house at midnight with no shoes on because you were the path of least resistance?" I didn't have a good answer. "She has a sister," he said. "She has friends. She has a whole apartment building full of people she knows who would have opened the door. She came to you specifically." He finished his beer, set the bottle down. "I'm not saying do something reckless. I'm saying stop performing ignorance about something you already know." I said I would think about it. He said I'd been thinking about it for 37 days, and at some point thinking stops being thinking and becomes a way of staying still while you tell yourself you're moving, and he had limited patience for watching me do that to myself. I didn't ask how he knew it had been 37 days. I'd told him the full story twice in detail, which is one more time than I tell Kevin anything I genuinely care about. And he's the kind of friend who keeps track of these things not to use against you, but because he's paying that close of attention. She called about 2 weeks after that Sunday, and it was a phone call, not a text, which from Kara was itself a kind of signal. She was precise and economical by text. 3 sentences, maximum, always exactly as much as the situation required and no more. An actual phone call meant she needed to say something that couldn't be compressed into that form. She said she'd filed for divorce. She said it in the clean, level voice she uses for anything that requires handling. But underneath the level, I could hear the particular quietness of someone who has made a decision that cost her something significant and is now holding herself very carefully so it doesn't cost anything more. I said I was sorry. She said she was a little, but mostly what she felt was clear. And clarity after a long period of fog was its own strange and welcome thing. I said I understood that. She said she knew I did, and the specific way she said it deliberately, like she'd considered exactly who she was saying it to and meant it for me specifically, settled in my chest and didn't move for days afterward. We talked more after that. Not every day, but regularly enough that I noticed I'd started drifting automatically to the back window whenever I picked up my phone. The place I go for calls I want to give my full attention to, as though the yard somehow makes focusing easier. She was staying at a hotel while the practical pieces sorted themselves, since the condo had been Marcus's before it was theirs and she had no interest in remaining in it. I had a sense, from the way she mentioned the hotel in passing, briefly, without dwelling on it, the way you mention a fact you've decided not to feel too much about, that it was wearing on her in the particular way that hotels do when you're staying in one not for travel but for transition, when every morning you wake up and the room is clean and impersonal and completely unaware of you. I mentioned the guest room once, carefully. She said she appreciated that. About 10 days later, she asked if the offer still stood, and I said yes without hesitation. And she came the next weekend with a duffel bag and her laptop and the very particular expression of someone who has decided that accepting help this time is the right call and is doing it despite finding it harder than it should be. I put clean towels in the bathroom and didn't make a thing of it. The second stay was different from the first in ways that were hard to specify but easy to feel. The first had been crisis, raw and careful, oriented entirely around not making anything worse. This one was quieter, more deliberate, more chosen. She was there for almost 2 weeks, and we fell into a routine that neither of us ever named out loud, which I believe was a mutual unspoken decision, because naming it would have meant categorizing it, and neither of us was prepared to do that yet. I cooked dinner because cooking is how I make a space feel like something real, and inhabited is happening in it. She set the table every single night without being asked, just stood up from the kitchen table where she'd been working and did it, napkins and all, in the practiced way of someone who has decided this is her part of the thing and she's going to do it every time. I noticed it every night. She'd have cardinal updates when I got home from work. Frequency, duration, attitude. I'd wash my hands and ask follow-up questions. We'd eat and talk until one of us noticed it was past 10 and acknowledged regretfully that tomorrow existed. Mrs. Okonkwo has lived directly across the street from me for 22 years and has never in that time encountered a situation she didn't consider it both her right and her responsibility to have a fully formed opinion about. She arrived one Saturday with a covered container of jollof rice. She brings this approximately 4 times a year as a kind of neighborhood tax that I'm always genuinely glad to pay. And she looked past me to where Kara was visible at the kitchen table and said without preamble or softening, "Is that your wife?" I said, "My ex-wife." Mrs. Okonkwo received this information the way someone receives an answer they believe may be technically correct but functionally provisional. "She was here before," she said, "at night." I said that was right. "She's good," Mrs. Okonkwo said, in the tone of someone who has conducted her own assessment through her own methods and is reporting results. "She is," I said, because there was no more accurate thing to say. She handed me the container, held my gaze for a long and pointed moment that communicated several things efficiently, and said, "Don't make it complicated." Then she walked back across the street at the brisk and satisfied pace of a woman who has done what she came to do. I turned around and Kara was watching me from the kitchen table with the expression of someone who had heard every word of that exchange through the screen door and was not going to pretend otherwise. I held up the container of jollof rice. "Mrs. Okonkwo thinks you're good," I said. Kara said she was already aware because Mrs. Okonkwo had come over that morning to borrow milk. I said Mrs. Okonkwo had a fully stocked pantry at all times and had no legitimate need to borrow milk from anyone. Kara said she suspected the milk was a pretext for something else, and we laughed. Both of us at the same moment, the real kind that comes up from somewhere you weren't aiming for and doesn't stop on a polite beat. And I stood in my kitchen holding a container of rice while my ex-wife laughed in the afternoon light filtering in through the window. I want to be specific about what that laugh felt like because I think it matters. It wasn't the polite social kind, the kind you produce because silence after a joke would be uncomfortable. It was the other kind, the kind that means the two of you are actually in the same room in the same moment and both find the same thing funny for the same reason, which is rarer than it sounds and harder to manufacture than people realize. Something that had been sitting at a slight wrong angle inside me for a very long time quietly and completely settled into place. 2 nights later, I told her. Back porch, after dinner, the yard dark, the bird feeder a shape against the evening sky, the air cool enough to notice. We'd been sitting in the kind of weighted quiet that has actual substance to it, the kind that is either nothing at all or everything. And by then I was honest enough with myself to know which kind it was. I said I wanted to tell her something directly instead of not telling it, which she said immediately sounded ominous. And I said I didn't think it was, and she said that was approximately what something ominous would say in its own defense. I acknowledged the fairness of that and said it anyway. I told her that when she'd shown up the first night, I had constructed a very complete and reasonable explanation for what I was feeling. Compassion, decency, old familiarity, the natural response of a decent person to someone they used to know being in pain. And I had believed it because it was easier than looking at what was underneath it. I told her I'd spent the weeks after thinking about her in ways I didn't have a clean word for, and that I wasn't putting this on her at a time when she already had more than enough. But Kevin had told me plainly that I was performing ignorance about something I actually knew. And Kevin is profoundly irritating and nearly always right, and eventually that combination becomes impossible to argue with indefinitely. She was quiet. A car went by out front. She had her arms loosely crossed, not defensive, just settled. The posture of someone listening with their full attention. Kevin told you to say this to me? I said Kevin told me to stop pretending. That is very Kevin, she said. Then after a pause, I drove past my sister's apartment that night. The light was on in her living room. I could see it from the street. I drove past Rachel's place. I've known Rachel since we were 22 years old. I kept driving. She looked at me steadily. I know what that means. I've known for a while. Then, I don't want to make the same mistake twice. I need slow. Real, actual slow. I said I had spent 20 years being patient with systems that responded very badly to being rushed, and slow was something I was genuinely built for. She laughed, quiet and brief, just a breath of it. That's almost romantic, she said. Almost, I agreed. I'll work on the rest. She leaned her shoulder against mine just barely, and we sat there looking at the dark yard and the shape of the feeder in the sky. And after a long, comfortable while, she said, "The cardinal is going to develop theories about who lives here." And I said I thought he'd probably adjust in time. "Yeah," she said, leaning just slightly further in. "Probably." 1 year. I want to say it plainly, without ceremony, because plain is how it happened. Not in a sweep, not dramatically, just carefully and steadily and real, the way things go when neither person is trying to prove something or outrun their own hesitation or make up for lost time by moving too fast. She got her own apartment 6 weeks after that porch conversation over her own lease, her own space, her own terms, which was exactly the right call, and I said so, and I meant it without any ambivalence. We were slow the way she'd asked and the way I'd said I was capable of. Actual dates with reservations, the kind that feel intentional rather than accidental. Weeknight calls when there was something worth saying, and sometimes when there wasn't quite, and we just wanted to talk anyway. Around month 3, I became a recurring pale blue block on her color-coded weekly calendar, Thursdays and Saturday afternoons, both of them. She showed me this once with the particular gravity of someone presenting a document of some real consequence, and told me she didn't allocate recurring blocks to things she wasn't sure about. I told her I was genuinely honored by the pale blue block. I absolutely meant it. Last spring she moved in. It was her idea, which mattered to me in a way I didn't try to put into many words because some things communicate better through the fact of them than through description. She brought her planners and her good coffee maker and a small plant she had kept alive through 3 apartments over 4 years with the kind of consistent, patient attention that tells you everything about how she approaches things she's decided are worth keeping. She put her planners in the third drawer of the kitchen island, the one I had always, for no reason I could have articulated, left completely empty, just always empty, as if I'd been saving it without knowing what for. And she reorganized the linen closet with labeled bins and a system I don't fully follow but have committed to respecting as a matter of principle. She started setting the table every night, same as the second stay. I started cooking every night, same as then. Mrs. Okonkwo appeared on the third day with rice, looked at the two of us standing together in the kitchen, and said with complete and unhurried satisfaction, "Good. No more complicated?" Kara said, "Yes, ma'am." I said I was still working on it. Mrs. Okonkwo looked at me with her standard expression for me, the one that says she has filed me under means well and finds that sufficient, and went back home. She showed up at my door at 11:47 on a Friday night, barefoot on my porch steps, hazard lights blinking in the dark behind her, and she said I didn't know where else to go, and I said, "Okay." I think about that exchange a lot. Not the crisis of the night itself, not the mascara or the heels or the closed grocery store parking lot where she'd sat alone for 2 hours, but just those specific words, in that specific order. I didn't know where else to go. Okay. Because she didn't come to me because I was the convenient choice or the familiar one or the path of least resistance. She drove past her sister's lit window. She drove past the friend she'd known for over a decade. She came to me. And what I understand now on the other side of everything that followed is that she came because something between us had always contained the specific thing she needed most on that particular night. Someone who would receive whatever she was carrying without requiring her to manage how it landed, without needing her to be okay before she was actually okay, without adding anything at all to what she already had to hold. I didn't know I did that. I know it now. She told me, somewhere around month 4, that the reason she had always trusted me, even when we'd stopped being good at being married, even from the careful, considerate distance we'd maintained for years, was that wanting something from me had never felt to her like wanting too much. I told her no one had ever said anything like that to me before. She said she knew she could see that I didn't know it, and she'd been quietly furious about it for years. I asked her why furious. She said, "Because it's the most important thing about you, and you were just walking around living your life completely unaware of it. You should have known. Someone should have told you a long time ago. I've thought about that a great deal since. There are things that can only become yours after someone hands them to you directly and makes you hold them. Every morning around 7 now, if you happen to be in my kitchen when the light is just beginning to come through the window over the sink, you can watch the cardinal arrive at the feeder in the backyard. He is consistent and committed and has very clear opinions about the sunflower seed to safflower ratio, which I have learned over time to accommodate. Kara is usually already at the kitchen table when he comes. Mug, planner open to the current week, the focused early morning quiet that I have come to understand over time is its own particular form of warmth. Not loud, not demonstrative, just completely, fully present in the way that actually matters. Sometimes she says he's here, and I come stand beside her at the window, and we watch him for a minute before the day begins. Sometimes she doesn't say anything, and I can tell from the way her head is tilted that she's already seen him, and I just come stand next to her and watch too, and neither of us says anything, and that is also completely fine. Both of those mornings are good ones. Both are more than good. The guest room is an office now, with her printer and her filing system and a lamp she brought from her apartment that gives the room a warmer light than the overhead ever did. Her heels are in the front closet, right next to the everyday shoes, standing there easy and comfortable like they have always lived in exactly that spot, which I have decided is the most honest and accurate possible representation of what it actually looks like when something genuinely works out the right way. She doesn't have to drive past things anymore, neither do I. If someone who had once been the whole center of your world showed up at your door late at night with no shoes on and nowhere else, they actually wanted to be, not asking for anything dramatic, not making any declarations, just needing somewhere that felt quiet and safe enough to finally stop driving? What would you have done? Would you have let them in without making them explain themselves first? Would you have had the patience to sit with it and not rush the thing, and say the true version of what you were feeling when the time finally came instead of the easier, more comfortable, more self-protective version of it? And has anyone in your life ever seen something real and true about you so clearly and named it so specifically and so plainly that it changed the way you understood yourself afterward permanently in the way that you simply cannot undo? I genuinely want to know. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one of them more carefully and more consistently than you would probably expect. If this one stayed with you after you've heard it, leave a like. It helps more than I know how to properly explain. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. I will see you then.